Hi, and welcome to CASA Presents Your Mental Health. I'm Leslie McDonald. Well, we're now 1 year into this pandemic, and a recent poll showed that 40% of Canadians report their mental health has declined since it began. And there's every indication that this is far from over. We're all impacted in ways big and small, and that's where this webcast series is designed to help. It's brought to you by CASA Child, Adolescent and Family Mental Health, a respected nonprofit organization that's been around for more than 30 years in Alberta, providing assessments and treatment services for infants, children, and their families. Well, for nearly 4 years now, they've shared their vast network of expertise and resources through the Dr. Roger Bland Lecture Series. Well, we bring that discussion online, giving you reliable, accurate information to inspire conversation, hope, and wisdom. We have some pretty significant partners who bring support and expertise to the series as well. We want to thank Alberta Health for making this series possible, and to our ongoing partners, Edmonton Public Schools, the Institute of Health Economics, and the University of Alberta Department of Psychiatry. We also acknowledge Global Edmonton for their partnership in this monthly series. Well, our topic for this webcast is compassion fatigue, something that we would normally associate with caregivers and helping professionals. But also, as we'll explore, it's something we're all experiencing in various degrees during this pandemic. We'll be getting the lived experience with a panel discussion a little bit later, but first, our special guest today is one of Canada's foremost experts on this topic. Francoise Mattheus is a registered psychotherapist in the province of Ontario and a subject matter expert on topics related to psychological and secondary trauma. She's worked for nearly 25 years in community mental health, crisis intervention, and with the military and law enforcement. Her company, Tend, runs training programs across North America to help professionals recognize and manage the impact of working in high-stress, trauma-exposed settings. Francoise has worked with the Los Angeles Police Department, with Cirque du Soleil, and many other organizations that do high-stress exposed work. She's also a TEDx speaker and author of several publications, including the Compassion Fatigue Workbook. Welcome, Francoise. We're so delighted to have you here. First of all, let's get an overview of compassion fatigue and erosion of empathy. What is it and how does it present itself?
So compassion fatigue is this progressive emotional and physical exhaustion that we can develop over time. And that can happen in our work and also in our personal lives. I'm sure we've all had a friend or a family member who went through a really prolonged crisis. And at the beginning, we were there for them. And at some point, we just felt spent. Either we just had nothing left to give, or they just weren't making any progress towards resolving their issue. And the same thing can happen in our work environment, of course.
So who's impacted by this? This pandemic has changed everything. And so we can see that healthcare workers are definitely impacted. Who else is impacted by this?
Oh, family caregivers. As you're referring to the pandemic, I'm thinking of so many parents who are trying to juggle work, homeschooling, caring for their aging, vulnerable parents. So we're really seeing a physical and emotional exhaustion in all family caregivers. We're also seeing it in professions that we wouldn't necessarily have thought about, as you were mentioning, obviously healthcare workers, first responders. I think those are naturally, folks that we would all understand, would be impacted by this. But we're thinking about teachers. We're thinking also about customer service folks. So people who are answering phone calls, from disgruntled or dysregulated customers. So it really is a really broad range of folks right now.
There's sort of three areas that encompass all of this, and I want to get an idea of how they look differently before we get back into compassion fatigue. So one is compassion fatigue, and the other is vicarious trauma and burnout. They all sound the same, but really there are some differences.
Yeah, so the way to think about it, if you all think back to a grade 3 Venn diagram, these overlapping circles, there's obviously some overlap between the concepts, but they're not exactly the same. Vicarious trauma is indirect trauma exposure. So it's the way in which someone else's story can hitch a ride with you, even if you didn't see it yourself. That could be on the news. I know a lot of journalists, for example, have talked about having vicarious trauma from the traumatic stories they covered, but it could also be you as a viewer, right? That you're really impacted by something, but it could also be something that you've heard from someone else, for example, in the workplace. So, thinking about listening to traumatic stories, looking at difficult forensic material, and the volume of it will depend on the kind of exposure you have. So someone might be upset by a movie, but someone else might have seen 5,000 difficult stories. Burnout has to do with your working conditions, and it can happen in any profession. It has to do with your hours and your pay, your rewards, your recognition. It's really got to do with the nature and quality of your work experience.
And the kind of burnout that we're talking about is not just a little bit of fatigue. We're talking about something more than that.
Yeah, it can lead, some people end up having pretty significant symptoms of depression, for example, where they actually have to go on stress leave. They have to leave work for a certain period of time, or sometimes even permanently. We see increase in substance use, sometimes work avoidance, people feeling dread that they really can't imagine getting up another day to go into work. So there's some very real long-term consequences for the worker and of course the organization.
So why is it important to understand what the difference is with those? Or do the differences depend on how you would treat it or how you would view it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the thing about burnout is that in a way, and I'm not trying to be facetious, but it's the easiest one to address because providing you have another job, you can leave, right? If you don't have a good work environment, you're not well paid, you're not well recognized, you could move to a more supportive work environment. And unless the burnout's very advanced, you could probably, eventually feel really happy with your work environment. Secondary or indirect or vicarious trauma, which are all terms that are used interchangeably, that's really about how extreme it is. So a mild version of vicarious trauma, you could probably get over it in a few weeks, kind of stop exposing yourself to that, trigger, or talk about it with a loved one and you probably process it. For more extended exposure, such as people who work in child protection or child abuse investigation, sometimes they need more clinical skills, or again, they might need to remove themselves from that type of work. But that really changes us in a permanent way, I would say. Compassion fatigue, again, that depends. It depends on how extensive it is. Sometimes it's about refueling yourself and kind of saying, okay, I can't be the primary caregiver for this person. I need some help. I need to establish better boundaries. And at times, it's always a good idea to go consult a mental health professional if you're really feeling tapped out and completely overwhelmed.
What's the impact on the individual and then on other people around them if this becomes something that is prolonged?
Well, it's interesting. So the professions I work with, primarily, for example, looking at law enforcement, as some of you know, there's quite a high divorce rate among certain types of law enforcement professionals. And a lot of them will talk about the direct impact it has on their loved ones, on their significant others, on their children. What is it like to come home, to someone who's spent all day doing this and now they're no longer emotionally available? So that can be a very real impact. I know personally, I have 2 adult children, and they talked about how, as they were children, I sometimes overshared kind of the worst case scenario at all times. They couldn't just go somewhere and without me listing the 5 ways in which something bad could happen. So I think there are times where if we don't catch ourselves, we can be overly hyper aware of all the possibilities because it's kind of, in the nature of our work. So needing to watch that as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, you coach all over North America, and that's one of the things that you talk about, and I know as a parent as well, there's a fine line with how much you share with your children, and even in your workplace, if you're a boss, how much you share with your employees.
Yeah, and I think that we're trying to talk about removing stigma. In fact, I just gave a workshop this morning about barriers to accessing mental health resources, removing stigma, being more open and vulnerable. But I agree with you, there's also a fine line between that and what we call sliming. And sliming is oversharing graphic details without necessarily a purpose, sometimes for shock value, or sometimes we're so desensitized that we're not even aware of what we're doing anymore. And that can have also obviously negative repercussions.
I find it fascinating that this just seems so normal to talk about this now, and it seems so obvious, not just with the pandemic, But when you started out with this, no one was talking about this. This profession didn't even exist. How did you get into it?
Yeah, so if we go back in time a little bit, so I did my master's degree in the mid to late 1990s, and these concepts had not really, I mean, burnout had been around for a while, but we didn't talk about it in graduate school at all. And the other concepts hadn't even been published quite yet. So I started my career not knowing anything about this. And, they mentioned self-care like as an afterthought, like take care of yourself, but that was pretty much it. And I immediately went into a very high trauma exposed work environment. And I definitely noticed the work was having an impact on me. But what would worried me more and why I got so passionate about this is I was noticing cynicism and profiling among certain professionals. So maybe a triage nurse in Emerge wasn't as compassionate as I kind of expected, or a police officer, and I wanted to understand why that was. Now, at the beginning, when we designed our very first training in 2001, just as you said, we had to knock on so many doors and we had to offer so many free workshops. Back in the day, we're making flyers, like licking envelopes and stamps. Remember those days? And it took us quite a while for people to even recognize this. And once in a while, we got an open door, and quite a lot, we got a fair amount of pushback of people saying that these were soft skills, or even that we were going to make their professionals weaker by talking about it. We've come a long way in awareness.
Hey, you've really come a long way. When you work with LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, because those guys, they're taught to suck it up. So tell us about the work that you've done with, first responders and police officers and that kind of thing. What have you seen?
So what started happening, I think we're all familiar now with, the rising awareness of post-traumatic stress disorder some time ago now. Finally, there was recognition that PTSD was real. And then very unfortunately, about 10 years ago, there was quite an epidemic of suicide among first responders and law enforcement in Canada. In fact, we in Ontario there was an inquest to try and understand. The numbers were appalling. At the same time, LAPD, so Los Angeles Police has one of the most progressive peer outreach and peer wellness program of any law enforcement in the world. And they were witnessing similar rates of increasingly high rates of police suicide. And they decided to start doing outreach and peer support. And what we all realized kind of at the same time is that, yes, PTSD was one part of this, but there was so much more that we needed to acknowledge and start talking about, wear and tear, fatigue. We don't need to wait until people get to the most critical place, wanting to remove stigma and increase conversation. And I'm really impressed with the progress I've seen in the last 10 years. It's very encouraging.
One of the things I think that parents, for example, we're going to be talking to a parent a little bit later, a mother of 5 whose children struggle with various things, including mental health, and they don't feel often that they're recognized for the kind of secondary trauma that they go through, compared to, say, a healthcare worker or someone who's working in the front lines. I mean, so are the differences that big or small?
It's so interesting you say that. I was talking to someone yesterday who works in dementia care, and she said, no one's banging pots for us, right? And that is not a takeaway from the work of frontline workers and essential workers at all. This is not a competition, but it's true that there are a lot of invisible caregivers, and family caregivers really fall into that category. And I think part of what happens too for family caregivers is that the possibility for respite, I get to go home at the end of my workday. Even if I do trauma work, I get to go home and have a proper night of sleep. Family caregivers very rarely get a break. And there is absolutely a need for much more recognition of the burden and the erosion, and also the grief that this is, these are your loved ones and you care deeply about them, but you don't necessarily get to have a break. And when you do, you might also have guilt around that. So it's really complicated.
What's the link with trauma, especially secondary trauma, with things like disease and physical issues?
So one of the things that's frustrating about secondary trauma is that we don't have a huge amount of research. There are a lot of gaps in the research. So just to give you an idea, I was at a scientific conference last year where they said that the standard data they have, their typical research is a 46-year-old female white social worker. So if you're all of those things, we know exactly what's going on for you. But there hasn't actually been a lot of research done on people from different cultural backgrounds, different, professions. I mean, we have a bit of an idea, but we don't have that direct data where you can say, we have a lot more research on physician burnout, for example. I could quote a 2018 study for you from the Canadian Medical Association. We don't have that, but we are seeing increase in substance use, increase in chronic fatigue, insomnia, and a lot of other physical complaints as well as emotional, for sure.
One of the other things that you talk about is emotional depletion. Can you explain what that is?
I think a lot of people this year can relate to that. I mean, we were busy doing this work long before the pandemic, but I think this year it's really landed for a lot of folks where we just realized at some point that we're saturated. And one of the things I started talking about in terms of strategies is, I think a lot of us are guilty of doom scrolling, where before we're even up in the morning now, we're kind of looking through all the terrible news about everywhere in the world, not even our own, homes or whatever. And so emotional depletion can start with just feeling like either I feel everything, like I feel everything for the world. And I have some friends like that, they're very empathic. Conversely, sometimes we see people who are the opposite end of the spectrum. They're like, I just want to detach from everything. I don't care. I've totally cut off my, kind of feelings of empathy towards other people, which I think is also problematic. I didn't go into this field to stop feeling things, right? Like that's not my goal 25 years into my career. I wanted to figure out a different way to do it.
Well, it's interesting because, a lot of people now are avoiding news because of the impact of that on their psyche, and they just don't want to hear it. Or Zoom, they're feeling sort of overloaded. And this has been going on for a year now, which is crazy. And so what do you do about that? What is the best way to handle that, to manage it? How do you get your empathy back?
Yeah, so I have lots of strategies because I train on this and I think about it every single day. And I think that what a lot of people don't understand is that waiting till Friday night to collapse drooling on your couch and watch 6 hours of Netflix is not self-care. That's just crashing. And I think we've all done it, right? What we really promote, and this is backed up by really solid neuroscience, are micro skills. And micro skills are micro strategies, are things you can do every single day throughout your day. So if I can give you a really quick example, like you, I mean, I'm on Zoom all day right now. This is my reality, but I have all sorts of very small rituals, to start my day. I'm not saying 40-minute rituals. These are 3-minute rituals. How do I start my day? How do I end my day? How do I let my brain know that I'm off duty? Getting a bit of fresh air, resetting myself between calls. All these little micro skills can actually make a huge difference. People who do extremely high trauma work, like accompanying someone into court, we have rituals for them before, during, and after exposure. So there's actually a lot you can do, and they're free and they're totally manageable, and you can integrate them into your days. So none of these wait till I go on vacation and get sick, which is what happens to everybody anyways, right?
What have you seen as kind of the difference between people? There are some people who cope very, very well in this pandemic. In fact, they're thriving in it and taking advantage of this time. And other people who have just fallen apart. What do you think is the difference between those two groups? Are they doing something differently?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think, first of all, I get nervous when we talk about resiliency when it feels like there's a value judgment. So I don't ascribe to that at all. This isn't about like how some people were tough enough and those weren't, some people weren't. I don't agree with that at all. I think the first part is your pre-existing circumstances, right? If you had good, I mean, the number one protective factor is social support. We know that from lots of really good research. For example, after 9/11, there was some really good research to see who was going to get PTSD and who wasn't, who had been a witness to 9/11. And the number one protective factor was social support. So who is in your life? What I've also found is that folks who are introverts, so I'm not shy, but I'm an introvert. Like I love solitude. And so this pandemic has not impacted me as negatively as my friends who are extroverts and they're living alone. So it's also about your personality. And finally, it's about your coping mechanisms and your coping style, right? If your coping styles tend to be more healthy things, like when I'm upset, I go for a run, it's going to be more protective than someone else who tends to withdraw or do things that are necessarily not as healthy. So all of those factors really kind of predicted, who was going to do better and others. And the final one is financial. I mean, some people are falling apart because they're terrified or have no financial security. And that's a huge element of this, of course, as well.
People who've had to learn to cope well are people who work, especially people who work with young children who have experienced trauma. And so I want to bring in our next guest to contribute to that part of the conversation. He is a senior member of the Edmonton Police Service Child Protection Team. Sergeant Manuel Illner runs the day-to-day communications between the Child Protection Team and frontline officers at Edmonton's Zebra Child Protection Center. He also works with a multidisciplinary team at Zebra of Alberta Health Services, Children's Services, other police agencies, and Crown prosecutors. So really appreciate your joining us today, Sergeant. So the Zebra Child Protection Center, in case people don't know what it does, can you sort of give us an overview?
Sure. So the Zebra Child Protection Center is a child advocacy center, and it's actually the first one in Canada, which was established in 2002. And it's just a community response to how to deal with child abuse and child sexual abuse in a better way than was happening at the time. So basically, it's like you mentioned, it's a multidisciplinary team between police, children's services, the Zebra staff here, Alberta Health Services, Crown prosecutors, and it's all for a common goal of having a child go through the trauma that they have suffered, and then if it goes to the point of charges, escorting them through the whole court process, which is challenging in itself, but extremely difficult for children.
This is extremely difficult for people who work there as well. I mean, you have to be a certain type of person to be able to cope with that. Can you give us an idea of what some of these kids are going through?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we see the worst of the worst. So these aren't just like a spanking type assault. These are serious assaults and serious sexual assaults. So this is stuff that you and I don't think kids should ever have to go through. But the reality is that some do, and more than we'd like to happen, obviously.
Yeah. I think I've had a chance to go through and get a tour of the Zebra Center. I was very impressed with the setup and what you do. But I got to tell you, Manny, the idea of working in that kind of environment, I know that I would have a lot of trouble with it. And I imagine it's probably very challenging when we talk about secondary trauma for people who actually work there. How do you, what do you see that looks like, and how do you cope with that?
Exactly. I mean, the Edmonton Police is actually very good with kind of keeping tabs on our mental wellness, especially in units when we're dealing with this type of thing. So our unit, sexual assault section, homicide, those type of things. So we are actually required a mandatory annual wellness assessment where we actually speak to a psychologist for I think it's up to 3 hours, and it's just to assess to make sure that you're still fit to do the job. And that your mental health isn't suffering because of it. But aside from that, we also we have access to what we call EFAS, our Employee Family Assistance section, and that's available basically 24/7. So if you're having a rough time with anything, you can call them up and you can just organize to sit down and chat with somebody there. We have funded psychological treatments, so it's funded by the EPS, and it's available to anybody if you're having trouble with the type of stuff that you're dealing with. But aside from those type of things, we also do regular incident debriefs. So when we're dealing with a serious event, we have a quick debrief after that, an organized debrief where everybody kind of just meets and discusses how they're feeling, what they went through, that type of thing. So there's lots of different things. And then specifically to us here at Zebra, we have the VIP program, a very important pause program. So if you're an animal lover, we have our dogs on site that are meant for the kids for their interviews, but we use them as well. So if you're having a rough day, we bring those dogs into our offices to just hang out for the day, and it helps a lot of people. And then just finally, just leaning on each other here. I mean, we're all in here for the same purpose and doing the same thing. So talking with each other and our families, obviously. So there's lots of different ways that we deal with it. but it's a matter of accessing those resources.
So what kind of skills do you have to work in that environment, and what kind of skills do you need to develop?
Definitely organization. I mean, just like many other agencies and organizations in Canada and all over the world, resources are slim sometimes. So, and EPS is no different. So a lot of the issues that we have with things like burnout comes actually from the volume of work that we're doing. So organization is key. Just being able to triage files that you get and organize them, working them through them step by step, because it can become very overwhelming, especially when you're new to the unit and it's not something that you're used to the high volume of work that we're doing.
You have 3 kids, what, age 11 to 15, and you're married. How do you keep this out of your home life, or do you? What do you do when you go home?
It's tough. I mean, aside from the confidentiality things of not sharing that type of information with the family, you still. I mean, when I talk to my family about things that I investigated today, just give them basic information. But I'm involved with my family in terms of like sports and things like that. I coach my kids basketball. So just being able to spend time with them in something completely unrelated from what I deal with at work definitely helps that out.
I'm going to move on to our next interview because we all understand by now that extra burden placed on caregivers and family during this pandemic. And our next guest is a married mother of 5 children, each one with their own special challenges and gifts. Brandy Rye, I'm sorry about that, Brandy, is president of the Alberta School Councils Association and sits on a variety of boards and councils provincially and locally. She's also a member of CASA's Family Advisory Council, and she advocates to create inclusive, accessible spaces for youth. Welcome, Brandy. And I'm excited to talk to you because in many ways you live in both worlds. What do you mean by that?
Well, thank you for having me. And I think that as you mentioned earlier, oftentimes, parents, especially if you're a parent of a child with significant learning needs or mental wellness challenges, you're in the trenches and you experience a lot of trauma yourself, and you experience a lot of burnout, and then compassion fatigue happens also. And what we're experiencing in a global pandemic is that many of our colleagues, many of our fellow parents who typically don't have the same exposure to trauma and the need for supporting their children are having to do that right now through the pandemic, the same as you've been doing the whole time and trying to support and advocate for your children with needs. And so there's really no space where you can turn as a parent, to really receive that support right now, because every parent that you turn to is just as burned out, just as empty, and just as scared and anxious as you are on a regular day when you have all of these things that you do for your kids.
Wow. Tell us a bit about your family dynamics, because they're a bit more daunting than most or unusual.
Yeah, we are very fortunate. We have a very unique family, and so we have 5 children, and we're a blended family. And so we have children who have trauma needs. We have children who are biracial. We have queer children. We have children with learning needs. We have children who have anxiety and depression and other mental wellness challenges that they face when there's not a pandemic happening. And so then when you layer in a pandemic and there's social isolation that happens, because we have children with compromised immunosystems. And so, they have weak immune systems. And so because of that, our bubble has gotten smaller when our bubble really needs to be much, much bigger to support all of the needs of our children. And so our family is working through that, though, in terms of we're seeking out virtual support and we're trying to make connections, and we're trying to also set clear boundaries for ourselves and our children, because if we're not careful, we do that doom scrolling that was mentioned earlier, and you're seeking out all of these negative things that are happening in the world around you. And at some point, you just become so numb. And what I'm hearing from parents and from lots of teenagers that I work with is that you become so overwhelmed to the point that you become underwhelmed. And what that means and what they're sharing is that you no longer can really take in joy you don't relax, you don't put your guard down, because you've been stretched so thin and you've been given so much that there's just no room for anything else in your existence. Like, you are on survival mode 24/7. And that's really alarming to see what 1 year, with the system having to be so different, has done to so many families.
Wow. You know, you have so much on your own plate. You've got your own trauma that you have dealt with, and your kids, and all of those things that you have. But yet you go out and you sit on these boards, and you've joined the CASA Family Advisory Council, which advocates, and you reach out. So you obviously, you have a lot to offer. What are some of those things that you find have really helped you, ways that you've been able to help other parents?
I think that helping other people see that you can't fix everything, nor should you have to. And you also can't save everyone. It is not your job to save everyone and fix every issue that's happening in your community, at your school, or in your own family. And that we are never alone. We might feel alone. We might feel as if our specific issues are so unique to us that nobody else could possibly understand, but we are never alone. We are part of a larger community. And so what I really encourage parents and families to do is to really reach out, make those connections, and never be afraid to share with their extended family or their friend families, or even reach out for therapy, to say, I need this help. I need somebody to help me understand this, unpack this, plan this. I can't be the only person responsible for this. And sometimes it's just having another person who's in a similar boat say to you, you don't have to carry everything. That allows people to take a deep breath and start actively going through the resources that you've been able to share with them, and be able to do good things for themselves. We've all heard you can't save somebody else unless you put your oxygen mask on first. And so it's really the work that I like to do that I find fulfilling, is to share with others that you are just as important as every project or person or community aspect that you are trying to advocate for and save. And so take care of yourself first.
So Mandy, you've had a real opportunity to get an overview, sitting on the boards and talking to a lot of parents, an overview of what's going on out there. And there's a lot of talk about, challenges with funding, not enough resources, not enough support for parents and kids. I mean, it's a crazy question, but if you could, what do you think would make a big difference in terms of being able to help families?
Well, I do think that the funding is very important. And so when the healthcare and the education system are properly funded, predictably funded, sustainably funded, so that those services are in place for every family, for every student, for every Albertan that needs them, then you have a place to go. You have resources available to you. And the earlier that there are interventions, the earlier that there are supports for these families, whether they're in school, whether they're community supports, or whether they're through the healthcare system, that makes a healthier life now, which leads to a healthier life for the entirety of that person's life, because they build up those skills, they build up the resources they need to make it through all of the hard things that they have in their life. And the only way that you can provide that support is if you fund the services to do that. And so I think that governments really have to prioritize, and they have to put their money where they want their future to be. And it should be in the well-being of all citizens here in Alberta, and especially in our children, because they're so vulnerable.
I want to bring everybody back to have a discussion about this next part, because we're 1 year into the pandemic, as we talked about. Things have shifted, and we've still got a long way to go in this pandemic. Where do you see us going from here? How can we help people to cope with the situations? I mean, one of the things, we're talking more about it. We've never talked so much about mental health as we have now. So that part is a good thing. But where do we go from here? Francoise, do you want to begin?
Sure. Well, part of what concerned me at the beginning of the pandemic is I was hearing people say, when this is all over. And I was like, I'm not sure that's the way to go. Or I start now hearing people talk about post-pandemic planning. And I'm like, I'm not sure we're there yet either. So I think part of what we need to look at is, we are in the middle of a period of extremely disruptive change. That's just a fact. And the research is showing that it's no different in a way. The scale of it is no different than after the Great Depression or the Second World War. And I think it's a myth. Anyone who thinks that the Second World War ended one day where everyone ran into the streets, started making out, that's not actually what happened, right? It made for a great Life magazine photo. But what happened is there were years of, people who were displaced. There were years of consequences. That's not necessarily a negative thing, by the way. I think the reason I'm saying that is it forces us, for example, leadership, decision makers, and I love what Brandy just said, it forces us to shift into not just being reactive. And, this isn't a 2-week snowstorm that we had to deal with. This is the new whatever's coming down. And we need to really revise the funding, the priorities we give in terms of support, early childhood education, support for teachers, support for caregivers. This needs to really inform the way that we budget for things. We're never going back. So what's ahead?
Manny, I can't help but think of what your reaction must be to this, because I can imagine things have gotten a lot tougher in your unit since the pandemic began.
It has, for sure. When the pandemic actually first started, we actually saw a decrease in the amount of files that were coming into us. And we don't attribute that to a decrease in child abuse, not at all. What we attribute it to is that all the resources that kids were accessing to report to that the assaults on them and all that stuff, those resources were taken away. It's things like coaches, teachers, and so on. So when things started opening up again after that first lockdown, that's when we started seeing an increase again. And our numbers are basically the same, if not higher, from last year, including that 2 to 3 month lull that we had there, where things were not being reported as much. So it's been challenging for sure.
What does that impact have on you and your team?
Sorry, say again?
What impact does that have on you and your team? I mean, when we talk about secondary trauma, wow.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all of a sudden the floodgates open and we start seeing all these files, these serious assaults coming into us. And it's a bit demoralizing because, I mean, what we're doing right now is, we know we're just scratching the surface, but we got to start somewhere. And when all the stuff kind of starts coming in and our files are going through the roof, it's a bit demoralizing because it almost feels like we're not doing anything, but obviously we are. So it's been tough, but that's where we rely on each other and make sure that we're keeping an eye on each other and seeing those signs. Just when you notice that marked departure from the norm, that's when we start having conversations with each other to see where we can help.
Brandy, what kinds of shifts are you seeing?
Well, I think that in the work that I do, and then also in my family, what has been really interesting for me is there's no normal for us to go back to, because normal wasn't good enough before. And so the cracks that were there in the system have just been widened so that more people are falling through them. And so for me, post-pandemic is a total revisioning of our culture and the way that we support each other and the way that we fund things here in this province. And so for me and for my family and for the advocacy that I will continue to do, it is what do we want this to look like? Why are we not visioning and why are we not funding for that, as opposed to just accepting what has always been? Because what has always been, children were still suffering. Children still have needs that are not being met in the education system and in the mental health sector. So it was never good enough. And just because the system has been further strained because of the pandemic, I think this is an opportunity for everyone, for all leaders who make these decisions, to evaluate, to listen, and to do better moving forward, because normal was never good.
Francoise, one of the things that you said, where you talked about how when you give to one group, another group says, hey, wait a minute, what about me? Or if focus goes to certain groups, what about the other groups? And sort of, it must be incredibly overwhelming if you're in government trying to understand where the best, there's limited dollars, it's been a very expensive pandemic. Where do you put your resources? Where do you put your support? Because obviously there's a lot of need.
Yeah, I have two answers to that. The first one is that it's a heck of a lot more expensive to ignore this problem than it is to address it, right? So the long-term cost, we created this document that's called the return on investment of investing in your people's well-being. And I don't mean, stress balls and kale and pedicure. I mean, really. So it's actually way more expensive to ignore this than to invest in it. The second piece is what the research shows. I have a colleague who always says leaders are people too, and they're often the most stressed out members of an organization. So often what I see is that the frontline folks get all the workshops and the training, but leaders don't, or leaders are incredibly stressed out, but they're decision makers. And so we really encourage the rapport we have with organizations that we work with, like Zebra, for example. The leaders are involved all along the way. They're really aware of their own limitations, their own stressors. And that again removes that stigma, this notion that somehow, somebody developed this because they weren't tough enough. That's not at all what the language is. So look at leaders and invest in the well-being of your folks.
Wow. One of the things I heard from all three of you actually is it's that analogy when you're on an airplane, if things are going down, put the mask on yourself first, that you can't help anyone if you can't help yourself. Who wants to pick up on that one?
Well, that was me a little bit earlier, and I have to repeat that over and over to parents because as a parent, especially right now, you're trying to work, you're trying to keep everybody fed and the bills paid, you're trying to keep yourself safe in a pandemic, you're trying to keep your children well, and then also mentally well, and then you may also be taking care of your parents. So there's multi-generations that you are now responsible for. When you probably were stretched thin and didn't already have the coping skills that you needed to get through some of these stressors. And so over and over and over again, if you can take the time to listen to somebody and you listen for support, not for solution finding, because oftentimes people just need a place to put this. And then at the end, if you can just, encourage them to take a deep breath and to find ways to take care of themselves. And so earlier she was speaking about, the micro skill sets, how important those are, right? If you build in self-care is it's hard for me to say because people associate self-care with like bubble baths and things like that. And that's not what we're talking about. And so if you can take the time to define what true self-care is for yourself, what your resiliency coping skills need to be, and you can build those into your daily life, at the end of your day, you have something left for yourself, which you have to have, because if your own cup is not full, how are you going to pour it out to the people that you need to every day, right? So that's just the message that I try to give over and over again, because people sometimes need to hear that they are important all on their own, separate of everything they do.
And Manny, with all the things that you and your team have had to deal with, I'm sure you've developed some incredible strategies for being able to cope that would help other people. Can you share some of those with us?
For sure. I mean, being part of police culture, exercise obviously is the big one. Going out there, just simply if you go for a run or things like that. I mean, it's been tough with the pandemic, with gyms being closed. But if you have access to your own gym at home, or even just going outside now that the weather's starting to get nice, it's just to go for that run, and it's a huge stress relief, and it helps out a ton.
Francoise, you also talked about there are things that you can do on a day-to-day basis that can really help. Do you want to add to that?
Sure. So I know this is not available to everyone because I don't have a caregiver role right now. So I have the privilege of being able to get up and go for a walk every single day. So I'm aware of that, but I've done that almost every single day since the start of the pandemic, rain or shine. I was born in Northern Quebec. I know how to get a warm coat on. And what I have found, and I listen to podcasts a lot, and I made sure I wasn't listening to trauma podcasts, nothing to do with the pandemic, and it was my moment, but it was also, and the research has shown, just 45 minutes of walking 4 times a week makes a huge difference, decreases cortisol, improves every aspect. We don't have to be doing ultra marathons. We don't even need to have an extensive gym. And if you don't have that 45-minute available to you, because maybe you have a caregiver duties, even little mini breaks, throughout the day, 5 minutes climbing the stairs, jumping jacks, all of that, you're flushing out your stress hormones and just resetting yourself for the next part of your day.
And when you talk about reset, I'm thinking about one of the things when I spoke with Brandy, just the language that you use has changed. And that's really got to help as well in terms of, like, perception is everything. Perception is reality. And the language that you choose to speak about what's going on and about if children are going through challenges, that makes a huge difference too. That's something that's really changed, I've noticed.
Yeah, I think that I think that the more we've become aware of how much language actually manifests our experience, then we change that, right? Because when you know better, you do better. And so I think it's really important when you work with families or your own children, have needs that need to be met. They are more than the sum of, there's a child there right now. They are more than the sum of their needs. They are a whole person. And so it's very, very important for you to use positive people-centered language and to support them. And so you're right, the language itself has changed. And I think that that's part of erasing stigma and reaching out for help, because when that language changes, then you don't feel so bad about the fact that you need help. We all need help. I am a walking hot mess of a person, and I'm so grateful that people accept me exactly as I am, and that there's space for me as I am. And part of that, honestly, is because of the language of the people that have supported me in the last decade, right? So thank you for acknowledging that, because language is so very, very important as we help each other.
And I wonder too about stigma, because when we first started doing these talks 4 years ago, we started doing them because of the stigma around anything to do with mental health and how people looked at it. And I even said initially that I didn't have any of that in my family, and then discovered that everybody has that challenge. So Manny, especially in your environment and with police officers and with dealing with children, have you seen how the stigma has eased so much? Are people talking more about it? Has that really helped?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, when I first got on the job, you're expected to be that tough guy cop, and to be, if you're emotional, whatever, you're considered weak. That has so changed over my career. I mean, like I mentioned, all the other things that are out there for support for us now, and we're going through mandatory training constantly to do with mental health, and to look out for each other and look for those signs that when people are struggling, and it's a lot more accepted now. And I think EPS is one of the better organizations in the country for that. So I think we're pretty lucky here.
To really give an idea of how far we've come, Francoise, you said that in 2015 that the military didn't even recognize something called, secondary trauma.
Right. So it's interesting. I want to pick up on what Manny was saying. So EPS is one of the most progressive forces in Canada in terms of being really proactive about this issue. And you're right. So part of what a lot of folks, law enforcement, military, so on, they actually had to deal with an unfortunate backlash because PTSD, became known and it became disseminated. But then there was a bit of a backlash where we're seeing it right now among paramedics, where some people think, we believe it's true, but some people are faking it. Are they faking it? Are they using it as an excuse? Like that whole thing, which, I have a whole bunch of opinions. Of course, I disagree with that, but it kind of secondary trauma was kind of buried in this kind of PTSD backlash. And we've seen progress recently where we've been able to communicate it, but I think that our entry point is different. So we don't come in looking at the clinical side or people going on stress leave. We look at it more like, what is it like to come home to you? Right. So if I was working with Manny in a workshop, I would say, what's it like to be your significant person or to be your child or what have you? What is it like to have someone who does that kind of work come home? What is the impact on your loved ones in a non-shaming way? And I think that's the way to think about it. Who do I want to be, both at work and at home? And how do we reconcile those? And what are the tools that we can use so that we can do a great job both at home and at work?
Boy, this topic is so fascinating, and this hour has gone by so quickly. Before we finish, I'd really like to get final words from everyone. So, Brandy, would you like to start that off? Final words that you'd like to leave with people?
Yeah. So I think that it's just really important that we be personally aware of how we're showing up to situations. So are we taken care of? Are we regulated? Do we have our needs met? Because how we show up impacts how we serve others. And if you're a caregiver, if you're a parent, if you're an advocate, if you're a first responder, the way you show up is really, really important to how you do your job and to all of those people that you serve. And so I think it's important for you to ask yourself, how do I want to show up? And then you give yourself the support and the resources that help you show up that way as often as you can. And also, just to the comment previously, when there's significant trauma and there's PTSD and things like that, it's so hard because there's this if you acknowledge something, you need to do the work for it. And so if you can minimize the trauma that others are having, then you don't have to acknowledge it or fix it or help, right? And so I think that, if we can help each other all move to a place where we understand that everybody has a challenge in some way and everybody's challenge is valid and needs that support, then we can shift the conversation from disbelieving or stigmatizing or telling people, to toughen up or move on to people-centered language and love and support. And just imagine what our culture here will be 10 years from now if we can start doing that right now. This could be a silver lining of all of the horrific things that have happened this last year.
Wow, what a great final word. Sergeant Eller, what would your final words be?
I totally agree with Brandy. I mean, if we can make it through this pandemic, we can pretty much make it through anything. But I think the big thing is, especially when you're working in organizations and you're dealing with a lot of this secondary trauma, is look out for each other. Just always, like I mentioned earlier, that marked departure from the norm. If you see someone struggling, talk with them, offer them some resources. But then also, don't just seek out resources when you think it's time that you need to. Seek out resources early so that you can kind of work your way through that throughout. Just be aware of your organization's resources that are available to you. And there's tons of online self-care ideas that are out there that people should be accessing.
Wow, good advice. Francoise, final words.
2 words. So going back, leaders are powerful role models. What leaders do and say has a very powerful impact on the entire organization. And I want to piggyback on what Manny was saying in terms of communicating with one another, and also picking up on what Brandy was saying. Don't wait until, we call it the red zone. Don't wait till you're in the red zone. Really start noticing your own warning signs when you're moving from kind of being really well to noticing that it's not going so well. And those warning signs can be different at home and at work. But secondly, let people know in your life. So if you have a colleague, let them know what you need, because they notice, but they might not know, does she want a muffin or she wants me to leave her alone? We don't know. So have a conversation with your colleagues about that, but also at home, let your family or your loved ones know, I need space, or I actually need you to force me to go out for a walk. So it's all about communication. There's no mind reading. We've got to be able to talk to each other.
And before we go, actually, I want to remind people, if they need more resources, they can go to your website. Can you tell us what the website is? And we'll put it up on the bottom of the screen.
Sure. It's tendacademy.ca, all one word. And we have a special resource section for COVID-19. Everything is free on the COVID-19 page, downloadable tools, podcasts, infographics, tons of stuff.
Well, I've been going through a lot of it, and it's fantastic, and I learned a lot, so thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. You've been a fantastic group. To Manny, to Brandy, and of course to Francoise. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I hope it continues. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Thank you so much to everyone for participating today, to Francoise Mattheus, to Sergeant Manuel Illner, and to Brandy Rye. Francoise was also a guest on Global News Morning Edmonton for the regular monthly feature, CASA Presents Your Mental Health. You can watch a recording of her interview at globalnews.ca. We'd also really appreciate if you could share your thoughts about this session by taking our survey. Just click on the link in the description below. Your feedback is really important to help us with these sessions, to keep them relevant, informative, and hopefully enjoyable. And finally, I mentioned earlier that CASA is a not-for-profit organization, and so your support of their work with infants, children, and youth and their families is so much appreciated. If you'd like to donate, please go to our website at casaservices.org and click on the Donate button. On behalf of CASA Child, Adolescent, and Family Mental Health, thank you for joining us. I'm Leslie McDonald. Stay safe and stay well.